the Mayor, who's had to leave, but we're grateful for your earlier presence. Peter Ford, His Excellency, former British Ambassador. I sat in the British Parliament for almost 30 years and travelled the world in that capacity, met a great many British ambassadors, and I'm bound to tell you, if we'd had more British ambassadors like Mr. Ford, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in today. And His Excellency Craig Murray, the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, who I had on my radio show just a few days ago, sacked by the Labour Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, and I quote from his dismissal letter that you, Mr. Ambassador of Great Britain, or the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland as they call it, are being dismissed because you have over-focused on human rights. My comrades, John White and Neil Clark, and if they'll forgive me, most exceptionally, the extraordinary testimony that we've just listened to by one of the world's bravest young women. It's her, Eva Bartlett, who should be getting the awards that the white helmets are picking up instead. Brothers and sisters, comrades and friends, I'd like to join in the congratulations to Gregor Sharkey in assembling this panoply of witness to the crimes of imperialism, and how I wish that we could take this on tour throughout Ireland, throughout Britain, and beyond. Because the key difference between this meeting and most others, virtually all others, is that it has focused on the original sin of imperialism. It may seem incongruous. Someone coming from Britain, from Scotland, to the 6 counties of the north of Ireland, to talk to you about imperialism. This, of course, being Britain's first colony, or more exactly, as someone from Scotland, I can say this was Scotland's first colony, because Scotland colonized what they call now Ulster almost 100 years before the British state was even formed. It's rather like taking coals to Newcastle, hearing someone from Britain lecturing you about imperialism, especially in this cluster of anniversaries, which will be a theme of what I have to say. The 50th anniversary of the uprising of the oppressed minority in the north of Ireland in what came to be known as the Civil Rights Movement, the Troubles, though in truth Ireland's troubles visited by Britain are many centuries older than that. The anniversary, almost exactly, of the massacre by British forces of unarmed, peaceful demonstrators here in the city of Derry. It's one couplet of anniversaries to which I wish to pay homage. The other is this. This is in the immediate aftermath of the annual commemoration of the Holocaust, of the fascist brutality of Nazi Germany and its allies and its facilitators. I want to say this unequivocally. If it were not for the Russian people, the Holocaust would have continued until there was no one left to incinerate, if it were not for the victories of the Red Army of the then Soviet Union in Stalingrad, in Kursk, and onwards to Berlin, I would be speaking to you tonight in German, and the whole of our continent might still be governed by fascist brutality. Although, of course, the truth is, I would not be speaking to you in German because I would already be dead, as would many of you as opponents of fascist brutality. And so I echo my comrade John White's comments. We live in an era where we're supposed to hate Russia. We're encouraged at every turn to hate and fear Russia. Paradoxically, we're asked to love Germany, hate Russia. Well, I will never, ever hate Russia or remain silent while others generate hate against her. We owe a great debt of gratitude to the Russian people. And I like the old Russia. I'm not a fan of the new Russia. I wouldn't vote for Putin. But I tell you this, if every country in the world had a leader like Putin and a foreign secretary like Lavrov, we'd have a better world than we have today. I heard one of the earlier speakers, I think Mr. Ford, say that it was Mr. Clark, that we'd had almost now 20 years, imagine, of unending war. And that's true. But as I listened to all these speakers, I realized at the age of 63 that it's been one long bloody war. When I was born, the guns had only just stopped firing from the British and American annihilation of the people of Korea. You heard the quote from Eva, from Curtis LeMay. We burned down every town and village in North Korea, he said. We killed 20% of the population of Korea. We threatened to launch thermonuclear warfare against them. We killed 1 million Chinese, imagine. We killed 1 million Chinese who had entered Korea to stop the advance of the British and American war machine, because they knew that if they had conquered the north of Korea, they would have continued over the border to try and destroy the Chinese Revolution. And we wonder why North Korea is paranoid. Just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean they're not out to get you. And you don't have to look in the crystal ball. You can read it in the book. Our people may have forgotten the Korean War. The Korean people never did forget it. And you saw in that wonderful cartoon, was that Latouff cartoon, of Trump with all his rockets and his daft haircut, calling the Korean leader and his daft haircut Little Rocket Man. They seek to induce us into a state of panic that something must be done about North Korea maybe having one nuclear rocket that can reach the United States, when the United States has thousands of nuclear weapons that can reach and incinerate North Korea or anywhere else in the world. How is it that the United States is somehow qualified to possess a nuclear arsenal that could end life on this planet for millennia to come, but other people, to defend themselves, may not produce one? Is it because they're ruled by a madman? Well, the United States is ruled by a madman. Israel has hundreds of nuclear weapons. Israel is ruled by a madman. And I could go on through these nuclear powers. I'm not sure what you'd describe Theresa May as. Not a madman, of course, but not strong and stable either. And who comes after her? Boris Johnson? There's a madman if ever I saw one. Jacob Rees-Mogg with his double-breasted pajamas. Fancy his finger on the nuclear button. And Corbyn is treated as if he's the madman because he says he would never press a button that would trigger a nuclear conflagration that would wipe out humanity, indeed all life on this planet. He's the madman because he will not contemplate the end of Mother Earth. It's astonishing, isn't it? How everything is inverted. I love John White's speech so much, I'm going to steal some of his best lines for my next one. I won't risk it here because you know that he's the author. There's only one slight difference that I would have with what he said. He said that the media, the so-called mainstream media, are not lying. They genuinely believe it, what they tell us. With respect, I don't agree. Some may. Some of the fools may. But those who own and control, and the senior figures in our media, I believe, know exactly what they are doing. The great English man of letters, Dr. Johnson, said that the grimmest dictatorship of them all is the dictatorship of the prevailing orthodoxy. And that's the dictatorship under which we live. As John put it, an inch or so in which we can argue about the color of the paint on the walls at Westminster. But the essential parameters, acceptance of capitalism as the only workable model for our economic life, of a fake Westminster democracy until Corbyn, two cheeks of the same arse, or in the United States, the Republicans and Democrats, Tweedledee and Tweedledum, neoliberal economics and neoconservative imperialist politics abroad. That's the prevailing orthodoxy. So anyone who challenges it must by definition be portrayed as and turned into an outlaw. Isn't that the world in which we live? He was mentioned earlier, Hugo Chavez. He won 7 elections. 7. He was the most elected dictator in the history of the world. Did they ever for one moment acknowledge his legitimacy, even though he'd been elected more often than any of them would even dare to put themselves forward for? 7 elections and referenda he won. There's been a long line of these. It would take me all night to go through them. The new Hitlers. Long before Hitler, the Mahdi in the Sudan rose up to drive out British rule. 120 years ago, the massacre at the Omdurman, the digging up of his tomb, the cutting off of the skull, British armed forces playing football with the skull of the Mahdi in the desert, revealed, by the way, in the Pall Mall Gazette by Mr. Churchill himself, who witnessed it as a soldier journalist at that time. The Mahdi was portrayed not as the Sudanese people saw him, as a national liberator, driving out white men from, Belfast, Dundee, Middlesbrough, out there in the desert in their red coats, pretending they had the right to determine what happened in the Sudan. They saw him as their leader. But for the British public, he had to be a madman, a mesmeric savage who had to be crushed. And there have been a long line of them. Vanessa Beeley, often mentioned, her father worked for Anthony Eden. Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister at the time of the Suez Crisis. You'll recall Lady Eden said that she felt as if the Suez Canal had been running through her drawing room, as indeed it had, because we had to deal with the new Hitler, President Nasser, the greatest of all the Arab leaders, so far as Arabs are concerned, but the new Hitler was how he had to be painted to us. Some are the new Hitler and then they get rehabilitated. Arafat was a new Hitler. Then he was a teddy bear. Gaddafi was a new Hitler. Then he was Tony Blair's best friend, shelling out large sums of cash. I better not tell you all the people to whom he gave it. But I can tell you this. He paid for Sarkozy's election campaign in France. He paid for Berlusconi's election campaign in Italy. So he's an example of a new Hitler that miraculously transformed into our new best friend and then back again. So that when he was brutally sodomized with a bayonet, Mrs. Clinton, who many liberals think really should be the lipstick on the pig of American imperialism rather than the vulgarian Trump, said, "We came, we saw, he died." And then she laughed. Oh, how she laughed. Then it was Saddam. Throughout the 8 years of the Iran-Iraq war, we were piling as many weapons and export credit guarantees and financial assistance as we could possibly give him, as long as his forces were pointed at the armies of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Why do we have an Islamic Republic of Iran? Because when the socialist prime minister of Iran, elected by the Iranian people, nationalized the oil in Iran, we, Britain and the United States, overthrew him. Mossadegh, we overthrew him, reinstated the Shah of Persia, built him up into the worst tyrant in the area. And there's a lot of competition for that title. And then when he was overthrown by the Iranian people, suddenly we had a new Hitler again in the Ayatollah Khomeini. And we armed Saddam to fight him. As soon as he's fought, Saddam's now the new Hitler again. I was once trapped in a lift with William Hague. Imagine his good fortune. Imagine how he felt. Just me and him in the lift. The doors won't open. So I had some time alone with William. It was a glass lift, so nothing untoward could go on. But I said this to him: William, you've been wrong before. In fact, you've been wrong all your life. But you've never been insane before. But the policy you are following in Syria is literally insane. You are putting knives in the hands of fanatic extremists from all over the world that are going to Syria and decapitating children, priests, even a bishop, women, destroying churches, destroying mosques if they don't like the political line of that mosque, creating a reign of terror, all with knives that you are giving them. And I said, with remarkable prescience, you may say, one day, all these people with their knives will come back here. And they'll even be in this building, I said, in Parliament, looking for you and looking for me to cut our heads off. Isn't that what happened last year? Did it not happen last year that one of these fanatic extremists from the alphabet soup of fanatic Islamism with a knife murdered a police officer inside Parliament? And if he could have got into the building, he may indeed have found William Hague or others. He would have kept on killing until he was stopped. That's what our leaders have now brought us. Like a kind of revisit of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. You build a monster, and then you're surprised that once you've built it, it breaks free and out of your control, and is so dangerous that we call it a monster. In Afghanistan, in the 1980s, on the eve of the fall of Kabul to the forces of this fanatic extremism, I told Mrs. Thatcher in Parliament, you have opened the gates of Kabul to the barbarians, and the long dark night will now descend upon the people of Afghanistan. And so it came to pass. Not content with that, we have repeated it again and again. I'm not a fan of Gaddafi. I happen to think that it takes some genius to make Libya worse than it was under Gaddafi. But we've surely achieved it. There is no Libya. Libya does not exist. There are 3, 4, 5, 15, 25 Libyas, multiple armies, 3 parliaments, 4 prime ministers. Don't ask me how that happened. No borders, no state, not a failed state. A non-state has blown a hole in the frontier of Africa to the Mediterranean, and they complain about refugees taking to the boats and sailing towards them, the very countries that destroyed Libya. And not content with all these disasters, one after the other, they did it all again in Syria. And they're trying to persuade us to do it again. Whether it's Iran next, as General Wesley Clark long ago predicted with remarkable accuracy, all the countries they were going to invade and regime change, or whether it's a confrontation with the Russia to whom we owe so much. It's one long, bloody war. Never-ending war. Orwell couldn't have been more prescient in his novel 1984. It's one long war. We are permanently at war, which may, I hope, make you ask yourselves the question: if we have an economic and political system that depends on the mass impoverishment of millions of our own citizens and billions of the citizens of the wider world, plus endless war, maybe it's time we got ourselves a new system, which is what I think this panel is trying today to advocate. My last word is this. Forgive me if I have spoken too long. There are many tracts, giant tomes have been written about what is imperialism. I mentioned Orwell a moment ago. I prefer the definition he put in the mouth of his hero, actually was himself, Jim Florey, in Orwell's first novel, Burmese Days. Speaking as Jim Florey, a colonial official in occupied Burma, in what you might think was an unusual chat-up line, Florey is trying to ingratiate himself with a young woman. So naturally he talks to her about imperialism. The young woman asks, "What's imperialism?" And Orwell says through Florey, imperialism is occupying other people's countries and stealing their things. That's what imperialism is. Occupying other people's countries and stealing their things. You know that here in Ireland. I said that was my last point. I want to add one more. It was prompted by something all my friends have said tonight. You know, when the Irish people rose in 1916 against British occupation, against British colonial rule, they failed to pass the cricket test of the Guardian readers of the day. The liberal chatterati gathered around the Bloomsbury group. That's what they were known as. Fabians, liberals, quote-unquote socialists, all clucked and clucked in the magazines of the Bloomsbury group. that they could never support this uprising of Celtic obscurantism. Any Ireland that would come from this uprising would be priest-ridden, bog-trotting, a kind of foggy brigadoon, and they could never support it. But the Irish people did not require a certificate of authenticity from liberals in England. The only certificate the Irish revolutionaries needed was from the Irish people themselves. Ireland has largely overthrown imperial rule, though, as James Connolly predicted, if you merely run down the British flag on Dublin Castle and run up a green flag and nothing else changes, nothing much will change. And it's true that one of Ireland's 4 green fields remains in bondage. But you struck the first blow at the British Empire. And until all these empires fall, the world will never be at peace. Thank you very much indeed.
We will make America great again.